gentlemen, welcome to the first ever podcast of Deleuze Modeste, meaning modest or humble Deleuze, and we are transmitting from France, and our purpose is to provide you, our listeners, with some very humble and simple guides to understand and help you through the oft complex works of French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, Henri Bergson, Baruch de Spinoza, etc., etc. Our first chapter is our first Plateau. It is called 1899, Lake Rossi, Huskies Needed. We need a compass, and the obvious reference is to that year in which husky dogs and sled riders were introduced into the hitherto smooth space of Antarctica in order to striate it as much as it could have been. And the obvious metaphor is that our goal is to provide you with a very simple, reliable compass to navigate your way through the oft complex works of Gilles Deleuze, which at the same time are of an incredible simplicity, but sometimes in order to understand the simplicity, you kind of need to hack through the jungle with a machete in order to find the crystal or the diamond, hidden in the forest. So that's it. We will start right away, and we hope this will be a useful, practical guide to the virtual, actual, and possible worlds. Often savage, often wonderful, that Gilles Deleuze presented us to. Okay, so I'm getting into this example, and maybe I did mention before, maybe not, but I've been reading Deleuze for over 35 years now, and I do believe he's kind of like a fine wine or anything which has any kind of quality, meaning that you have to have experience to understand certain things. Time has to pass. You have to understand what memory is. You have to understand what catastrophe is. Francis Bacon, Cézanne, Van Gogh, when they go to paint, they are confronting catastrophes every time. So, this is not stuff for... you have to live and experience things, and then time passes with Deleuze, and you put things down, and it's been about 5 years that I've stopped. And then recently I picked up, I came across an article by chance on internet by a certain Dutch architect, and I'm not going to say his name. But he wrote a paper called How to Think Constructivism. Ruskin, Spuybrock, and, I just said his name, sorry, that's a boo-boo, and Deleuze on Gothic architecture. Anyway, maybe in the credits I'll put down the link to this paper, because it's actually a very good paper on Gothic architecture. My background comes principally from architecture, but philosophy at the same time. And certain things, when I read this paper, I kind of went back in time, and I thought it was quite well done. And he was talking about the numbering number in Gothic architecture, which is kind of a nomadic numbering system as compared to the traditional Cartesian architectural measurement system, let's call it. And I finally understood after a bunch of years what the numbering number means in Gothic architecture. I'm not going to get into that now, but so I got a bit curious, and I went on to the website to see the author is a Dutch architect, and I wanted to see the buildings he actually built. I repeat, in the early 2000s, when Deleuze was, very much in fashion, and you could get grants and money, etc., etc. And I looked at the buildings he built, and I was absolutely shocked because basically this guy was just building like big bubbles connected together and filling them with LED lights, which change hue every 30 seconds according to whatever digital program he's got going. And all just these spheres all fused together, or just kind of like worm-like forms, etc., etc. And when I looked at it, what he actually did, I said, you have absolutely no understanding of what smooth space means in Deleuze and Guattari's texts. Because Deleuze says, okay, the desert is smooth space until it's metricized, until it becomes striated, until it becomes measured. Same thing with the sea, until it becomes striated. For Deleuze, the true plane of immanence for philosophy, for thought, is unstriable. It is pure, smooth space. But, however, fortunately, Deleuze and Guattari gave us great examples of Gothic cathedrals as being examples of smooth space. Maybe not pure smooth space, but as they always say, smooth space and striated space are mixed and they have degrees. So maybe a cathedral is 90% smooth space and 10%. It's not up to me to decide on the percentages. It may also depend on the cathedral. But the point here is there's a big difference between a Gothic cathedral and a desert. Okay, a Gothic cathedral is very articulate. Its Gothic cathedral is not like the sea. And what this architect was doing was just saying, look, I'm going to fuse big bubbles together and put disco lights on, thinking that the poor guy that has to live in this building and paid a lot of money for this building is living in smooth space. Why? Because he has no orientation, he can't understand X, Y, Z because the space is green and it's red and it's all spherical and blah, 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 blah. But, I repeat, again, a Gothic cathedral is a prime example of smooth space. In textiles, we have weaving and, other examples. But a Gothic cathedral is a highly articulated geometric space. So, what that means is smooth space doesn't just mean it's a system without any possibility of a body that inhabits them to have any kind of orientation. Okay, you can say he has taken away a dimension, and the person inside that bubble has to orient themselves in Riemann space or whatever. But I repeat, going back to the Gothic cathedrals is a very precise logic with both Deleuze and Guattari, that those are very articulated buildings. Okay, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Gothic cathedrals in Europe. No one is the same, meaning that every cathedral is in a constant state of variation during its construction process because there's no planned outcome of how the building will be. And at the same time, each cathedral is a variation from the same guild who built them on the one before. There's no blueprint, but they do have a series of principles based on what Deleuze called the numbering number. So, to sum this up, and I'm wasting way too much time here, on internet, on YouTube, there's a lot of séances or lectures from Deleuze, which are being published on the internet, which is great. You always have La Voix de Gilles Deleuze, which is a gold mine of audio recordings and PDFs of a lot of his lectures in the 70s, 80s, in the early 90s, while he was still a teacher. And you can go and download everything, and you will learn so much, and it's always best to stick to the original text. But there are so many things on YouTube and so many papers and so many books that will just take you away from Deleuze. I mean, they'll just these are authors that don't understand what they're talking about. Not all of them. There are a few very good writers which fully understand, but they are very few and very far apart. So, just to sum it up, another point of this podcast, if we are capable of doing it, is to try and simplify things and make sure that we don't get out of the way. I mean, another name, I'm not going to mention him, got a very famous chair position in a very famous university, sustaining that Deleuze was actually a realist. But this is back in the early 2000s when realism was a big fashion, because Deleuze had passed away, and everyone incorrectly said Deleuze was an idealist, and now it's all about materialism, because on to the next thing, no? So we're going to jump on Deleuze and say, okay, yeah, he was an idealist, but really, if you look at his writing, he was just a materialist, kind of disguised as an idealist, and therefore, so my point is, Deleuze is very complicated. I mean, you do need outside references and help to figure some stuff out, and that's always been the way for me for over 35 years. But be very, very, very wary of what you come across, and do not be seduced. Deleuze was very playful, very smart. With Guattari, he obviously wanted to kind of follow Marx and Engels, but Deleuze also believed that friendship is basically the base of philosophy, the possibility of philosophy coming from post-Socratic Greece to his friendship, the polis, the plane of immanence, is something which is created between friends, So Deleuze intentionally wanted to write as a multiplicity, is not just himself, who was already multiple, but with Guattari, who was already multiple. So this book is a multiplicity, or these books. I'm talking about Anti-Oedipe, Mille Plateau, and Qu'est-ce que c'est la philosophie? And at the same time, he wanted those books intentionally to be, as he should have, not just boring, typical philosophy books, but kind of something modern, adapted to our times, adapted to innovations in literature. We're in the 60s with Anti-Oedipe. So also Mille Plateau, which was the 80s, was not so well received. But the point is, Deleuze also intentionally wanted to make, something quite modern. So that also leads to a lot of misinterpretations. So royal science, nomad science, it's all the names of the concepts, because the point was concept creation in those books with Guattari. And Deleuze believes that you can only create a plane of immanence between friends, and that starts with two friends. It could be as it was thousands of years ago in the Greek polis. It could be thousands of friends, 10,000 friends. You also have rivals, but you have a plane of immanence, Nowadays, friendship and I don't want to get into that here. It is questionable, but Deleuze clearly states our problem today is we have no plane of immanence, and what that essentially means is that friendship is no longer an essential value of our societies. Deleuze talks about an absolute reversal, no, from the Greeks to modern times. I've lost a ton of time here, and let's just go on very quickly to look at some very basic concepts and get this done with. Okay, so we want to get on to the quick and substantial facts, but digging up some stuff on the internet just to try and improve the way I express these things. I'm not actually a very good speaker or writer, surprise, surprise. But I came across repeatedly something I would like to warn everyone about, and that is that all these papers, most of them at least, always seem to mention this famous phantasmagoric last book of Gilles Deleuze, which he wanted to write, called The Grandeur de Marx, The Greatness of Karl Marx. Now, I wanted to be clear to everybody that this is absolute and utter horseshit. And anyone that writes about this has absolutely no clue about history or context or what actually happened. So, first off, distrust anyone that writes about the fact that Deleuze's last book was the grandeur of Karl Marx, because it's absolutely not true. It's absolutely illogical. And anyone that knows a little bit of history would know that there were two Italian pseudo Red Brigade members. One was called Franco Berardi, who has a lot of books. Rebel communist psychoanalyst, let's say. And the other was Tony Negri, who had a very complex history with communism in Italy, was a part of the parliament many years ago, and then was threatened to be arrested for the activities of the Red Brigade, which were carried out in what in Italy was called Gli anni di piombo, the years of lead, in which the communist Red Brigade actually, beyond doing a bunch of terrorist actions, they even captured the president of the republic and killed him. So the actual militants of the Red Brigade, as the years passed, many of them escaped to France to escape prison time in Italy, basically. France was very sympathetic to communism in that time, and many of those members, many of whom actually did murder and kill people, were granted asylum into France and live there to this day. And occasionally there are polemics between the Italian and French government. The Italians obviously want them back. They want to prosecute them, and then the French insist on that they're political refugees and they have to stay in France because they will be unfairly persecuted or whatever. But the point is, Franco Berardi, I've met both of them, Berardi and also Tony Negri. Berardi set a bomb off in front of a bank. This is like, let's go back 40 or 50 years ago. Didn't kill anyone, but was being chased by the authorities. Tony Negri at the same time was being persecuted as being a member of the Red Brigade. As to my knowledge, he did not kill anybody. But they both escaped to France, and they went directly to Paris, and they went to Gilles Deleuze, and they lived with him for I don't know how many weeks. Once again, Gilles was a very humble man, and took them in. And, Berardi and Negri were hardcore communists, and we all know that Gilles Deleuze, always avoided and hated dualisms and distinctions. So Deleuze considered himself to be on the left, but certainly not Maoist or communist or whatever. So these guys kind of stayed with their idol for a few weeks. Eventually came back to Italy. Berardi has written a bunch of books which may or may not be interesting to you. Tony Negri in the 70s was a Marxist, but also, while he was in prison, actually, wrote a lot about Spinoza. So there was an obviously link with Deleuze, who was, writing expressionism in philosophy. But years later, someone talked, I believe it was Tony Negri, who said that, yeah, Gilles told me that his last book was going to be on the grandeur of Karl Marx. And there's absolutely no evidence of this. And to be quite frank, I've met both of them, and they're not people, trustworthy people. I mean, Negri went on with his multitude books, like in the early 2000s, and this, that was when the G8 or G1 and all that stuff was going on. So, he marketed in on that and made a lot of money on these books with this pseudo-Deleuzian concept of the multitude, a multiplicity of people, without really having any clue of Deleuze's actual philosophy, and without a relatively deep understanding of Spinoza. And so now we're going to get on to the actual facts. But I repeat, whenever you come across this thing about the grandeur of Deleuze, I'm not saying discredit the author who believes in this or writes it without any kind of proof or transcript or absolutely nothing. I mean, Deleuze's last opera was Immanence, a Life, and I think that is really the apex of his entire life. I mean, when immanence becomes immanent to nothing or only itself, that is when you can truly talk about a life, not a subject, a life. When immanence is absolutely 100% pure. So I doubt Deleuze has already dealt much earlier in his career, in Difference and Repetition, with Marx. Marx is a wonderful philosopher, a wonderful critiquer of capitalism. Marx's reversal of Hegel and his concept of the idea was something quite important to Deleuze. He believed that, the idea has this, under Marx, has this sense of immanence, which is actualized in throughout the whole capitalist system. So Marx is someone who contributed to Deleuze's thought in a very important way, but that's not at the end of his life. I mean, let's just be serious here. Okay, anyway, let's move on. Okay, so now that I've ranted and gone on about 20 minutes beyond what I imagined the length of this podcast was being, bitching about various things, let's try and jump right in to the heart of the matter. And hopefully, I can't guarantee that this is the best way to confront or start with Deleuze, so I might possibly revise this or just erase this whole podcast and start again from the beginning, or just do away with it altogether. But still, we're going to give it a shot. So let's see if I can bring up window capture here, because I think seeing the written things are better. And there we go. Wow. So I'm going to write as much as I can down as possible, because it helps me and it will probably help you too. So what is our very first question about Gilles Deleuze? Was he an idealist or was he a materialist? So I put down a definition of idealism here. Any various system of thought in which the objects of knowledge are held to be in some way dependent on the activity of the mind. Okay, very simple to understand, and let's go to the other side of the dualism. Materialism. Materialism is a form on philosophical monism, which holds that matter is the fundamental substance in nature and that all things, including thought and consciousness, are results of material things, such as simple chemistry, our nervous systems, etc., etc. Okay. Okay, so without wasting any more of your valuable time, let's try and get down to the substance of this whole issue. So first question, Gilles Deleuze an idealist or a materialist? So let's just quickly look at what those two terms mean. Idealism, any various system of thought in which the objects of knowledge are held to be in some way dependent on the activity of the mind. Quite simple. Materialism, the other part of the duality. Materialism is a form on philosophical monism, which holds that matter is the fundamental substance in nature and that all things, including thought and consciousness, are results of material things. Material things such as chemistry, neurons, blood, nervous systems, heart, etc., etc. So for a materialist, all of that stuff is just results of purely material interactions in which give us an illusion of a sensation, let's say. And once again, I'm just going to go ahead and translate monism, define that. Monism attributes oneness or singleness to a concept. So a monist basically says, just as we define material matter, it's all about matter and nothing else. Our thoughts and feelings and sensations are just effects of what's actually going on out there, which we can not comprehend in any form whatsoever. So we have our first dualism, and to answer our question initially, is Deleuze an idealist or a materialist? Obviously, the answer is he is neither. Deleuze was not so naive, and he was interested in something entirely different, which we'll get into very, very quickly. So, we're going to look into a second duality here right now. And that is the empiricism, realism. I'm going to try and realism. I'm not even sure of my spelling here. But we're going to define the second duality. So what is empiricism? Empiricism is an epistemological view that holds that true knowledge or justification comes only or primarily through sensory experience. Empiricism emphasizes the central role of empirical evidence in the formation of ideas rather than innate ideas or traditions. So, I have two notes here which are kind of out of order. I'm going to fix this as I go along. Let's get that out of here and put that down here. And then we're going to go to the other side of the coin on our second dualism. Realism is the viewpoint which accords to things an existence or nature which is independent of whether anyone is thinking, let me correct that, about or perceiving them. So once again, realism and materialism are not exactly the same thing, but these are more two general processes of thinking. So our second question is, was Deleuze an empiricist, or was Deleuze a realist? So the answer is Deleuze was indeed an empiricist, even though he correctly created his own version of empiricism, following from Whitehead and Hume, an English empiricist school of thoughts. And strictly speaking, I would not say that Deleuze was a realist in any way, and that is something we're going to get into right about now. And so I find myself at a very strange crossroads here, because at this point, and we're talking about the early stages of Deleuze's career, but I could move on either to Hume or to Immanuel Kant, which is an extremely interesting dialogue between both of them. And we know that Deleuze is an empiricist. And so ideally, I would proceed by way of pluralism or multiplicity, in which I would speak about both at the same time. But unfortunately, I have to make chronological order, and I don't have the mental power to try and attempt to do some kind of breakdown like Hume, Kant, which would be interesting, but I'm sure you could write books about that. So going forward, we have determined so far that Deleuze in his young career is very interested in empiricism. And Deleuze states quite famously, let me dig up the whole phrase here if I can do it briefly. Obviously I cannot do it briefly. Hang on one second. Here is the full phrase. I've summed it up here. Deleuze famously states, I consider myself to be an empiricist that is a pluralist. So the full statement is as follows from Gilles Deleuze. I've always felt that I'm an empiricist, that is a pluralist. But what does this equivalence between empiricism and pluralism mean? It derives from the two characteristics by which Whitehead defined empiricism. The abstract is not explained, but must itself be explained. And the aim is not to rediscover the eternal or the universal, but to find the conditions under which something new is produced. So once again, we have defining empiricism. It is the valorization of the corporeal, sensual, and material over the abstract idea and the supernatural. Empiricism emphasizes plurality, multiplicity, and difference over unity, sameness, and centrality. Deleuze rejects abstractions and conceptions precisely because... Huge spelling out. Let's try and fix that. Thank you, word. Precisely because they deny difference and plurality. So going forward, we have some extremely important keywords we need to synthesize. Multiplicity and plurality, not exactly the same thing, but there's an equivalence. Difference are two concepts or notions, we'll define them later, are obviously central to the opera of Deleuze. So, once again, for Deleuze, creativity plays a central role in empiricism. So I will quote him once again. Empiricism is by no means a reaction against concepts, nor a simple appeal to lived experience. On the contrary, it undertakes the most insane creations of concepts ever seen or heard. Okay, so from here, going back for a second, just quickly backtracking, what we know is that Deleuze is interested in creativity and pluralism, which he discovers through empiricism. And we have to keep in context, we're in post-war France, where Freud and Marx dominated the political and philosophical discourse. Obviously, l'anti-Oedipe, anti-Oedipus was a huge, violent reaction against the anti-pluralism of Freud, and also interpretations of Marx, which in Deleuze's and also Pierre Félix Guattari's opinion were kind of very static, boring, non-creative readings of Marx. So, Deleuze was interested in the creative, and I'm going to read this line right here. As an empiricist, we have the valorization of the corporeal, sensual and material over the abstract, the idea, and supernatural. Empiricism emphasizes plurality, multiplicity, and difference over unity, sameness, and centrality. Deleuze rejects abstractions and conceptions precisely because they deny difference and plurality. So, I think this idea of plurality is quite intuitive if you're an empiricist, meaning you want to base knowledge on sensory experience. I'll give you a very quick and simple example. I'm not too sure if this is going to be wise or not, but the other day there was a huge storm here. There are a lot of strange weather storms, taking place in southern Europe, and I was outside on the terrace, and it was clear and sunny, and then the temperature dropped by like 7 degrees in 10 minutes, and then black clouds rolled in, and it was really kind of apocalyptic, and the sun was still shining over here, and then these black clouds were rolling over, lightning, rain, thunder. If we want to go into kind of Deleuzian abstractions, behind the storm, there are intensities, difference in pressure, electrical charge, difference in temperature, which are kind of the invisible forces, behind the causing. This is kind of a partial causality of storms, but from a sensory point of view, and I think this is very simple and very intuitive. It's just there's a lot of things going on, for my senses. I have lightning, light, darkness, thunder, the sounds of thunder, and then water is falling all over the place, and then ice, even some hail came down, so it was an ice storm. So on so many levels, if you're dealing with sensory experience, I mean, that is a multiplicity. A storm in itself is made up of all of these kind of elements, and kind of what I believe Deleuze is saying is that there's a tendency in realism and idealism, which Deleuze essentially says are not too different from one another in terms of the genetic basis of the thought behind it. If I read I'm looking right now, a definition of a storm: a violent disturbance of the atmosphere with strong winds and usually rain, thunder, lightning, or snow. So, what Deleuze is saying is this incredibly rich multiplicity, pluralism, this richness of all these forces in a storm. But if you reduce it to a single idea and concept, and we'll get into ideas and concept later because that's kind of a complicated, well, at the same time simple but complicated progression of Deleuze's thought about ideas and concepts. Everyone says Deleuze is contradictory, first you saying ideas, and no. When you get older, you get wiser and you learn. Otherwise, when Deleuze is 80 years old, does he have to repeat the same things when he was 20 years old to be consistent? No. He's reading, he's learning like anyone does, and he's just progressing, and his thought is getting richer, and it's just absolutely normal. So anyway, the point is, if I just take a simple concept, an idea of a storm, it's just kind of like, okay, a storm is a disturbance of the atmosphere, and that tends to depict the storm as some kind of unity, which is always the same, which repeats, ignoring the richness of the real or the sensible. No two storms are the same. There have never been, storms repeat, but storms repeat with difference. So two storms can never be the same. So each time, that's also a kind of creativity, which could also be defined as difference, and we'll get into that a little bit in this episode and more in the next episode. But we're referring to Deleuze's repetition and difference, or difference and repetition. Sorry, and but it's like throwing the dice. Things do repeat, but they repeat with difference. So if you want to embrace the richness, the pluralism of the sensible world, everything is plural. Our senses, if you base yourself on your senses, we have eyes, ears, noses, mouths, skin, other things which I won't get into right now. But the point is, I think it's very intuitive that Deleuze would discover a kind of pluralism in the real, essentially, or the empirical given, or whatever you want to call it. So we're going to go on to this next thing here, which is this is from Hume. Causality is to see clearly that it is the idea that is presented with something that has not been given. Very important, huh? Meaning that this is the future. The future is not given. When we sense something, we retain it in our past. We live it as the present, but the future is not yet given. So, in the idea, understand in a classical sense, the future is something which is undetermined. We already have had a previous experience, and so causality can have us believe the sun will shine tomorrow, believe is the key word. We have no guarantee whatsoever that the sun will shine tomorrow. It shined for billions of years, but it could anything can happen in the infinite cosmos, and so we believe. That's all we can do is believe it will shine tomorrow, as it probably will, because in the very small durations or time frames in which we live, it's probable that we're always going to have the sun shining. It's a problem for very distant future generations when the sun won't shine. Yet such an occurrence has not happened in actual fact. So if we want to ground the sensible as not belief but knowledge, we have to accept the fact that we have absolutely no guarantee that the sun will shine tomorrow. We believe it. It probably will, but it is not an actual fact. As it is something that is always in the future, that is our causal relationship to be. So, here we go. This kind of belief is where knowledge starts for Hume. As we know the sun will shine, causality has to know enough to go outside of a future experience to a future effect that has not yet occurred. So later on we'll get, I've just written Bergson because obviously it should be pretty clear how Deleuze makes a jump from Hume, who does deal with time, time belief, and the very famous and well-known contractions, synthesis of time, and but it should be pretty clear here how Deleuze, and we haven't dealt with Kant yet, which is next up, and Bergson will probably be another chapter here. But what's important to understand is that Deleuze defines himself as an empiricist. He defines empiricism as pluralism. It's not the same thing as multiplicity, but for now we can say yes, pluralism, multiplicity, and also difference. Difference obviously meaning that if we create an idea which later on for Deleuze will probably transform into a concept, the future is something that has not occurred, and that must be taken into account of our idea. I think from What is Philosophy, Deleuze's last book with Pierre-Félix Guattari, you could talk about the concept of the idea. So the idea is been a concept which maybe or maybe not started with Plato in antique Greece and has undergone many changes throughout the history of philosophy. And in confronting Hume, Deleuze discovers multiplicity, pluralism, difference, because no two things in the real are identical, the same. They are always different. Even if they repeat, there is repetition, they are always different. And the basis of the idea, let's say the base for our knowledge, has to take into account that we contract actual experience, we live it, we contract it into our consciousness, and that's the past. But the future is always unknown, and there's a certain degree of belief, at least from Hume, that the sun will shine tomorrow. And believe you me, I don't know if it's in 14 million years or 200 million years or 4 billion years, the sun will not shine tomorrow. It will run out of its own energy source, or it will implode or explode, or maybe in 100 years it will fall into a gravity field of some unknown dark matter black hole. Now they're discovering white holes. So there's no, the empirical given, the sensible, offers us no guarantees for the future, and that's the important point here. As I said, we can already understand how Deleuze will pass into Bergson as time will become an extremely important element of Deleuze's thought. And I believe we're going to pass on very quickly to Kant and try and define the fact that Deleuze in his early career defines himself not only as an empiricist but as a transcendental empiricist, and that is a huge, very important distinction. And that's something which Deleuze kind of traced out and thought that Kant was working towards, and Kant was working towards a kind of transcendental project. But this is where Deleuze is, I'm not going to say he's going to skip from Hume to Kant, because I'm sure he had already read all these texts, but in our explanations, just say the easiest, most logical way is to skip from Hume to Deleuze and see how an empiricism, which implies multiplicity, pluralism, and difference, becomes a transcendental empiricism. Okay, so we're going to make a final push right now to the end of this chapter, and I owe a sincere apology to everyone, because I've just noticed that while I believed that the last few cuts on this video I was showing you all my notes on Word, that I had some kind of glitch in OBS and you couldn't see them. So hopefully you can see them now. It's a little bit too late to go back, but I'll make it up in one way or another. I'll make them either downloadable or do a second chapter going back over all this, hopefully in a more concise way, including the notes. Not that there's anything really genius or original in them, but you know, seeing the text also helps, I think, to understand things a little bit better. So we ended up with Hume. We know that Deleuze is an empiricist, and that for Deleuze, being an empiricist means being a pluralist, someone interested in difference and multiplicity. There are heavy implications in Hume for the temporal, meaning Henri Bergson, and then eventually in difference and repetition we'll have our synthesis of time by Deleuze. But we'll leave that for a later date. And so, going forward from being an empiricist, Deleuze was also a transcendental empiricist, as many people ascribe Immanuel Kant to have been. And a transcendental empiricist for Deleuze means someone who's interested in the genetic conditions for I can't spell. Let's fix that up. Hending. Wow, I can't even do the correctly. The real. So once again, Deleuze is not a realist, strictu sensu, but he is, however, interested in a transcendental project which creates the genetic conditions for understanding the sensible. So first off, we're going to have to make a big distinction here between two words, transcendence and the transcendental, which, as similar as they may seem, have very different meanings, and perhaps transcendental is a bit more nuanced. And perhaps Kant was the first to make this distinction. So if we look first at the transcendent, I've written here Plato and the idea. The definition is something that goes beyond the limits of ordinary experience of knowledge. So why did I write down Plato? Plato, I guess, was one of the first philosophers who posited a concept of the idea which was external or beyond the sensible, meaning beyond lived experience. So for Plato, an idea was something which existed beyond everything in a kind of other plane of existence or whatever. And it was populated by ideas of everything, and ideas were perfect. So Plato would say, in the transcendent world, there exists an idea of a tree. That idea is a perfect tree. Everything we find in our sensible world is a copy of the transcendent idea of a tree, and is never perfect. It can be better, worse, more or less perfect, but will never be perfect, because the only perfect tree is the idea of a tree which is beyond the limits of the sensible and beyond this world and beyond us. So this will obviously famously lead into theology and Christian ideas of God being beyond this world, and our souls when we pass away going to paradise or hell or wherever we're going to end up, but that is extra sensible stuff, and it's just kind of completely outside our limits of understanding. The Transcendental, Kant tells us it's not the transcendent, and Kant had a very complicated relationship with the transcendent, as many philosophers had since the beginning of philosophy, but especially since the 17th century. The transcendental is that which makes experience possible. So I'll give you a quick metaphor which may help to understand this. Paul Cézanne, the French painter, in his interviews once said that the thing which he wanted most in his life was to have the eyes of a newborn child, meaning a newborn child experiences reality in its crudest state. No, if we think about a painter, a newborn child, as he is immediately born, is just looking around and doesn't recognize everything and doesn't understand resemblance or what a tree is or a house is, and he's just immersed in this kind of irradiant radiance, luminescent field of colors and etc. And that was what Cézanne in some kind of way was searching, this kind of innocence before we get into sameness and identity and recognition. A tree is a tree, a house is a house, a dog is a dog. But for a newborn child, is just in this irradiant flux of becoming, where colors are shifting, things are moving. And so Kant, in the Transcendental, is interested in how this kind of flux of sensible becoming, how it becomes intelligible. How is it possible our experiencing the sensible in this infinite flux of becoming. So what Kant, another nice spelling here, what Kant proposes as transcendental, let's call them modes, not a good word, but Kant says we have an innate sense of faculties, and these faculties are attributable to every kind of species, and in particular, Kant says, as is written, there exist various transcendental, another great example of spelling, conditions that make experience knowable. So this is called cognition, human cognitive facilities. So we have kind of invisible, apparently non-material means of organizing the flux of the sensible and make it into something cognitively intelligent. And for Kant, this is the mind is the agent of cognition and the account of the conditions that are required for something to be an object of cognition. So Kant will tell us there are two fundamental, and I don't want to get too much into Kant right now, so very, very quickly. There are two capacities of the mind. The capacity of affection or receptivity, in which we receive and are affected by the sensible. And there's also self-prompted or spontaneous activity, when we have agency and we autonomously act. So we receive and we are capable to act or react. From there, what Kant says is beyond these two fundamental capacities of the mind, there are three or four, depends on how you look at it, mental faculties, which are special cognitive powers, unique to us, but not only to us, but us humans in you know, according to our evolution and what we have become. We have sensibility, understanding, and reason. And in a lesser way, the fourth is intuition. And for Kant, these faculties are transcendental, in as so far they determine the conditions for perceiving the sensible or experience. So our capacity of feeling, sensibility, our capacity of understanding, and our capacity of reason, in a lesser way, our capacity of intuition, is that which determines the conditions in which we perceive the sensible, the empirical given, the world, the universe, the cosmos, the real, whatever you want to call it, you can pick and choose. But Kant is saying these are the four ways in which we organize that chaos into our cognition, and that's how we structure our perceptions of the world, essentially. And so on to the home stretch, and hopefully you're still seeing my word notes. So what Kant is saying is that faculties are not transcendental. They are not eternal things on another plane of existence. Faculties are modes in which we understand the sensible realm. So a huge difference from transcendence. And at this point, in order to understand that a little bit further, we're just going to get into very quickly into the idea of transcendence and immanence. And we know that Deleuze, together with Spinoza, were two of the arch enemies of transcendence, and in favor of a philosophy of immanence. In Deleuze's case, pure immanence. And so what exactly is immanence? And this is very important to make the distinction between the transcendental which for Deleuze will become the virtual, and the transcendent, which is something above and beyond this world. So immanence is defined as the state of being inherent or exclusively existing within something. In theology, the state or, whoa, awesome spelling, quality of a deity exclusively existing within the universe. So the most famous example is the three famous Latin words by Spinoza, Deus sive natura, literally meaning when I speak about God, I am speaking about nature, meaning for me, God and nature are the same thing. So for Spinoza, God was not transcendent. God instead was kind of an infinite existence, which comprised the totality of the universe. So that is the most classical example of immanence, and that means essentially that everything is within the sensible. Nothing transcends the sensible. Deleuze will later have problems with Hegel because Hegel is saying spirit is immanent to the sensible, specifically history. So when Hegel is saying spirit, he's talking about something transcendent, something which is cannot be empirically determined, which is beyond the limits of experience. Therefore, kind of like an idea from Plato or the traditional Christian theological sense of God being above and beyond this world. And so, yeah, in immanence is something which is always existed throughout the history of philosophy, but starting with Spinoza in the 17th century, immanence continues to grow in its importance in philosophical thought at the cost of transcendence. But transcendence still remains, and Deleuze's main project was to eliminate transcendence everywhere and anywhere. And this is why in his final work, A Life, Deleuze says immanence can only be immanence when it is immanent to nothing but itself. And that means when you say something is immanent to another thing, that generally means something transcendent is immanent to our perception. And this doesn't work for Deleuze, because he does not want anything transcendent, because the transcendent is an abstraction that itself needs to be explained, and Deleuze wants the genetic conditions for thought, the genetic conditions for apprehending the sensible, the real. And if you have transcendent elements in there, it cannot be pure. You're always falling back on a static abstraction. So, going on. With Kant, immanent principles are those whose application is confined within the limits of possible experience. So in order to understand this a little bit, immanence means that things are within experience. Nothing transcends experience. A good example, and this is a partial explanation of immanence, but Husserl, a phenomenologist, he had a famous analysis of like the way we perceive a chair. No, if you're in a room, in the back of the room, you see a chair, and Husserl will say that the part of the chair that you actually perceive with your eyes is immanent with your perception and therefore immanent within your consciousness. And what that means is, what I actually see, I'm just seeing one side of the chair. It's like a perspective, and I see one out of four sides of a chair, no? So that which I actually perceive is immanent within experience, meaning that there are no abstractions. I've seen it, and my eyes have, like a photographic plate, have made that perception, and therefore that is an immanent experience. But Husserl, and later Deleuze will obviously critique Husserl on this, Husserl says all of the parts that you don't see, however, create a transcendent object because you did not actually physically perceive them. Therefore, they become a transcendent object. So with Husserl, I'm just using an example to explain, the idea that what you actually do perceive is immanent, meaning everything is there and you got it, you grasp it, and that is also immanent to your consciousness, which I know we're not supposed to use immanent to, but this is Husserl, and the rest is transcendent, and we'll get into this later, but it's just an example to try and distinguish between conceptually between immanence and transcendence. So going on, transcendental principles are those concerned with our mode of cognition of empirical objects. So once again, Deleuze is interested in the genetic conditions of perceiving and understanding the real. So Deleuze is definitely not a realist, and we'll get into this hopefully in the upcoming chapters. However, there is the possibility, bad word, but the real can be apprehended given that we have the correct genetic conditions of thinking about the real or the sensible. So almost finished here. I put this in capital letters. Let's see why. Thus, transcendental principles do not transcend or transgress the limits of possible knowledge, but rather make knowledge of experience possible. So once again, Deleuze is quite Kantian in this sense, obviously with the faculties. Deleuze will go far beyond that, but Kant must be given credit for this idea that we need the correct conditions in order to experience the real. If we're just using static concepts or simple scientific concepts or whatever, we can never engage the richness, the difference, the multiplicity of everything going on out there. So more spelling errors everywhere. I'm just repeating myself. Genetic conditions for comprehending the real. Once again, repeating. The great enemy of Deleuze was the transcendent, anything resembling. Deleuze was a big enemy of resemblance, and we'll get very quickly into that. Transcendental empiricism, Kant refers to a set of conditions which are thoroughly immanent to being. Once again, immanent to being. This is not quite Deleuze, but Kant is saying that the faculties are immanent to our being and not transcendence. So our being, if you eliminate transcendence, is kind of depends on the faculties we have. Transcendental empiricism, Kant refers to a set of conditions which are thoroughly immanent to being. Difference between Deleuze and Kant. Kant's transcendental are merely, another spelling error, are merely conditions of the field of sensibility. Deleuze's transcendental conditions are genetic conditions. So this is where Deleuze overcomes Kant and steps beyond Kant in his own philosophy. And instead of saying that the transcendental or the faculties are just conditions, Deleuze is saying that they are genetic conditions. So in order to understand that, let's go along. Deleuze will take Kant to task for tracing the transcendental from the empirical, which leads to a circular argument. The conditions are supposed to account for the condition, yet we arrive at the condition by tracing them. Let's fix that up. From the condition. So what does this mean? This means we take, in Deleuze's opinion, Kant is taking the empirical as he understands it as a philosopher, and he's tracing the transcendental, which leads to a kind of end of the road or a strange circular argument, because the conditions, that means the sensible, are supposed to account for the conditioned, yet we arrive at the condition by tracing them from the condition. And in capital letters, and we arrive at the transcendental based on its resemblance to the actual or the condition. So once again here, Deleuze is highlighting this problem he finds in Kant, and this is actually a very important point, is that Kant is setting up a transcendental field based on the faculties which resembles the sensible, meaning that our minds operate essentially in the way we perceive the sensible. So the trap here is that Kant is setting up a transcendental system which accounts for why we perceive things the way we do, based on resemblance, meaning our faculties in some way should resemble what we are actually perceiving. And Deleuze is essentially saying that this is kind of a just another an illusion. There's absolutely no reason to believe that the transcendental has to resemble what we actually see or perceive, which, if you think about it, is not too crazy, pretty intuitive, because I don't know, maybe dogs can hear different pitches, or frogs have lesser faculties, or there are insects that can perceive different wavelengths, etc., etc. So there's no real reason to assume that human faculties are one, superior, and two, are the ultimate source of knowledge, because the human best perceives the sensible by tracing the sensible and then making up a set of transcendental faculties, which basically just kind of an explanation, essentially, of what the sensible is. So Deleuze is saying there's no reason why the transcendental has to resemble what we actually see, because if the goal is to actually perceive the sensible, the real matter in itself, why assume that our faculties are an ultimate source of transcendent knowledge, no? Once again, that's a little bit intuitive on my part, but I do not think it is entirely incorrect. Going on, thus we get a strange sort of operation where we begin with the actualized object of experience, that is the sensible, trace its abstract form from the object, and treat this form as an a priori invariant ahistorical necessity, overcoming any processes of production, becoming, or genesis, and treating philosophy as an apologetics. Can't even write that down. Let's get that zeta out of there. As an apologetics for the status quo. So once again, on one hand, Deleuze is very enamored of Kant for this discovery or creation or whatever of the transcendental field, but at the same time he's saying that genius idea, but on the other hand, I mean, why model the faculties ultimately are creation of Kant as a philosopher. I mean, he's saying these are the faculties, reason, understanding, intuition, or whatever. And but how is he doing that? What they're saying is he's tracing an abstraction of an object, and then setting up faculties which essentially say we perceive that object because your faculties are the same as an abstraction of that object. So if I see a house, for example, I take an abstraction of the house and then create a picture, an image, or mental abstraction. And then I go to my faculties and I have understanding, and reason tells me that. But Deleuze is saying there's no reason to consider as genetically valid conditions for knowledge that things have to work by resemblance, no? And so this is where we come at a very important point for Deleuze. Space, only a genetic account of the relation between the transcendental and the field of material being can break out of this vicious circle. In this connection, the transcendental will share no resemblance to individual entities. So Deleuze is saying, once again, transcendental field, all good, because that's how we get to the genetic conditions of thought. However, there's no reason why the transcendental field should resemble what we believe we are actually seeing, because everything would be the same, no? Every storm would be the same, every house would be the same, every person would be the same. It's just another, difference, multiplicity, and plurality is completely ignored under these conditions. So Deleuze says, yes, transcendental field, I'm a transcendental empiricist, yes to the transcendental field, but there is no reason why it should resemble what we have been conditioned to understand from the sensible field. And this will have a lot to do with the faculty of reason in Kant, but we'll get into that later. So, back to Deleuze, the transcendental, which for Deleuze we can call the virtual, unlike Kant's transcendence, does not resemble the actual, but instead as a set of genetic potentials that, still can't put spaces in there, produces something entirely new in the course of being actualized. And just to conclude here, I have a very good classical example of this idea, concept, notion of Deleuze about the transcendental not needing to resemble or be traced from the real. Let's read this really quickly. This concerns the differential, the virtual, and I've talked about storms, but we'll talk about a hurricane. So, the example here is that the other day, as I already mentioned, there was a big storm over here and dark clouds and lightning and rain and all this crazy stuff, which was a multiplicity, a plurality of things, etc., etc. But if I wanted to find not a transcendent reason for that storm, I could, if I wanted to do that, I could say Zeus sent that storm, or God sent that storm, or Buddha sent that storm. Because he wants to punish me because in my last life I was like a serial killer or something. No, that would all be transcendent. But if I wanted to make a transcendental explanation of that storm I witnessed, Deleuze is kind of saying if I were Kant, I would start to extract the elements from what I have actually imminently witnessed, so that storm, at least from my perspective of what I saw, was imminent to me and was imminent to my consciousness, and it still is in my memory until it fades out. So if I were Kant, maybe I would go and say, well, my faculties determined that it was cold, and then reason told me that it was moving to the sea, and then my understanding told me this. I intuited this, but Deleuze is saying that you're just tracing back what you actually imminently witnessed. And you're relying on your faculties, and you're just apologizing basically for what actually happened. And the case with Deleuze, for example, if you take the example of a storm or a hurricane, Deleuze would say that there's a transcendent field, which is imminent to that storm, or that storm is in imminence, imminent to itself, or that's something we'll look at a little bit later. But Deleuze is saying in the transcendent field there exists things called intensive differences, which are virtual, and the examples are temperature and pressure. And they will cause links between changes of air movement and water currents and precipitation into the clouds, and that would kind of be the transcendental or virtual cause of that storm, and that resembles in no way at all the actual storm that I witnessed in the sensible. So once again, these are intensive differences. We have temperature and pressure dropping here, there, and those are things we actually don't perceive. They're imperceptible. But they are intensive differences or forces which are transcendental, virtual, and they are actualized in the form of a hurricane or storm. So, we always have temperature and pressure, and if everything are under good conditions, they will be actualized into good weather. If for whatever reason in the real world air currents, pressure drops, gets colder here, water up here, precipitation here, then those intensive differences of temperature and pressure will be actualized into a hurricane, thunderstorm, or whatever. So that could be considered would a transcendental point of view from Deleuze, which would demonstrate that there's no reason to presuppose that transcendental field should resemble the actual or the sensible or what we perceive. So the last line, and we'll close it up here, is the transcendental or the immanent within the actual. So it's important to note here that the transcendental is immanent within the actual. It is not transcendent to the actual. So those intensive differences of temperature and pressure are not beyond reality. They are immanent within reality, meaning that in the atmosphere or the planet or the planosphere or the big molecule, as marvelously once Deleuze and Guattari described our planet, the big molecule, is that these transcendental field is filled with intensive, imperceptible, intensive differences which are immanent within the actual. They're only not visible, and they bear no resemblance whatsoever to the actual or the actualization of the event of a storm or a hurricane. Meaning I cannot see air pressure, I can measure air pressure, I cannot see temperature, I can measure temperature. That would be quantitative, not qualitative, but that's another issue. Hopefully we'll get into. But they are immanent within the sensible field. And to be perfectly sincere, that is the best way I can kind of explain this stuff, which for me is actually quite difficult to explain. And so our first chapter ends here. I hope someone may sooner or later appreciate this. Once again, I apologize for the missing notes. I'm probably 90% of this. I will do my best to fix that up if anyone is interested. I detest videos which plead for likes or links or whatever, but if you want to do whatever you want to do, benvenga. If you want to drop me a line, if I've made any blunders, mistakes, please let me know. I'm interested. And I'm going to go back right now. Salute you all until the next appointment. And I'm going to go back to becoming animal, I think. That's what I do by night. So the Wolfman is out. And thank you again, everyone, for your attention.